Welcome back everyone to the REST API series. In this video, we're going to do a bunch of setup together so that we can actually get all our tools in order so we can actually start working with REST APIs and building out our first set of backends with a little bit of theory first. So in this video, we're going to see the tools we're going to use, namely the programming languages and the kind of different clients we're going to be using and how they're going to be put together. I'm going to kind of do a little demo with some walkthrough of some of those tools if you haven't used them before, and we'll get everything nice and set up so that in the next video, we can jump into some theory as well as some actual code together. So let's just get right into it. All right, so to start, an intro for the REST API. This is the dev setup and the tools that we're going to be using throughout this entire course. So first and foremost, there is this cute little Deno here I have in the top left. And if this is the first time you're seeing this, that's a good thing. And if you're seeing this and you're feeling confused or even sad, I had so many people reach out to me and be like, Nader, please, can you do this in Node.js or some other language like C# or in Python or something? And I chose Deno, which is actually a JavaScript or TypeScript based environment, which I'll walk through shortly as we get to that part of the slides. But I just want to mention something right off the bat. If you're seeing this and be like, oh no, I don't want to do this series. Like, I don't want to learn this new thing, or I don't really care about JavaScript or TypeScript or any of that stuff. I care about Rust, or I care about Python or whatever. I'd like you to kind of hopefully be rest assured that honestly, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much. I chose Deno for a set of particular reasons very explicitly, which I'll outline shortly, and I hope that you agree with my choice. But beyond that, really, it doesn't actually matter because we're going to be focusing on most of the theories that are going to be applicable pretty much across programming languages and frameworks that you end up using. So hopefully, regardless if you're doing this in Python in your own framework or vanilla or Rust or whatever happens to be, all this stuff is going to kind of, the concepts are going to carry over and it's going to work out pretty well for you. So that said, I'll go a little bit more into Deno, but that's going to be the main tool. This is going to be kind of a quote unquote upgrade from Node.js so that we can actually start working with JavaScript and TypeScript to build out our APIs. So I'll show you kind of where to get that and how it works shortly. The other tools here you may or may not have seen. VS Code, probably you've seen before. This is going to be the editor that I'm going to be using for all the videos actually, and we're going to be writing our code in here together. If you have another editor you want to use, feel free to use that. It doesn't really matter again what editor you use. I'm just going to be using that editor because it's probably one of the more popular ones and easier to get set up and started. I do have a video in the JavaScript series on this channel on how to set that up, as well as the terminal, which I'll mention shortly once we actually get to that part of the video. The next tool we're going to need is something called Insomnia. Now, you probably haven't seen this one before, and if you have, great. This is actually kind of like a quote-unquote replacement for another tool that you might have seen called Postman. Postman is a REST API client or other API type of client. My kind of challenge with using it was that it just had so many features, and a lot of the features required you to log in and make accounts. It also wasn't open source, which I'm not really a fan of. So I wanted to pick Insomnia, which is basically the same thing as Postman. It's open source, a little bit, in my opinion, easier to use, quicker to get into and out of. And it's just pretty smooth, and I can demo things exactly as we need for this entire course, and you can use it even in your own production environments or on teams if you need to. So I'll walk through that shortly. And finally, for the web browser, now we're not really going to be using the web browser very much, maybe just here and there a little bit. Our primary source of interfacing or communicating with the APIs that we're going to be building is going to be through a client like Insomnia, or Postman or Thunder Client or whatever you end up using. But I do want to show that there are cases where we could use a browser, and I'll use Chrome to look up things, and also use Chrome to show certain types of requests and what they might look like in a different environment than in a client like Insomnia. And finally, this is kind of a footnote, but I'll bring it up as we set up VS Code really quick together. There is an extension for Visual Studio Code for Deno specifically. You can grab that from the kind of extension like marketplace, and I'll show you how to do that as we get to that part of the video and write our first Deno code just to make sure it actually works and our environment is set up. But this adds a lot of really nice features and just makes it a bit easier for us to actually start writing our code. And I'm going to be using it pretty much in every video just to do some quick setup so we don't have to keep manually writing a bunch of stuff. And it has some nice linting and some other features in there as well. Okay. So I want to get some prerequisites before we get to a bunch of this stuff. So here we go. These are the prerequisites, JavaScript. Now, I was actually really happy putting this together because I was like, oh, okay, that's not bad. Like that's one prerequisite. It's not too high of a bar. Frankly, even if you are not 100% familiar with JavaScript, it doesn't really matter too much. The stuff that we're going to be going through together is pretty easy to ramp up to, at least, and I'll try my best to explain it. So if you're coming from another language like Python, or C# or Java or what have you, hopefully it kind of makes sense. Most of the languages do something very similar anyways. Also, we're going to be using TypeScript a little bit, and we're going to be ramping up to that. Now, if you hear that and you're freaking out a little bit, don't worry too much. As I mentioned down here, we're going to be learning it as we go. I'm not going to be explicitly teaching TypeScript, nor are we going to go into like the deep parts of TypeScript. We're just going to be using it for the parts that are useful and make sense, specifically the typing information, also why we're using Deno for the backend API. Okay, so really, if you're not familiar with JavaScript, you can still follow along. It's not really going to matter that much because, again, the theories are going to be transferable across languages and environments. It just might be a bit easier if you go through these videos and you have a bit of JavaScript experience. It doesn't really matter if it's front-end or back-end JavaScript experience. Just knowing a bit of the language, things like the variables and functions, and arrays and objects and all that kind of stuff will make it a lot easier, but I'll mention this stuff as we go as well. Some nice to haves, apart from a little bit of just knowing TypeScript, if you have that, is just VS Code. I'm going to assume you kind of know how to use that. As I mentioned earlier, I have a video on the channel on how to actually get VS Code set up, as well as terminal, the terminal in VS Code specifically. That's what I'm going to be using mostly throughout the video. Or videos, and I might use a separate terminal just here and there, just so I can easily switch back and forth between things and zoom in without making everything super gigantic in VS Code. But just knowing or having a terminal in VS Code that you've used before will make this a lot easier, as I'm not going to spend too much time with that part of the setup. So again, the recap of the prereqs, just pretty much JavaScript, working knowledge of it a little bit, and the rest you can kind of learn as you go, which is a pretty, hopefully, low bar for us all. And I'm really excited for that because this is going to be focused on actually the concepts of building an API as opposed to language-specific things. Now, I'm going to get to each of the tools in a second. But, there's probably like this niggling thing at the back of your mind. And you're just like, oh man, just no matter why, I just really wish this was, Node, or it was Java, or this was, whatever. I want to mention first, what is Deno and why are we using it before we get to the tools. Now, Deno is a relatively new JavaScript or TypeScript environment that we can code in, very similar to Node.js. Okay, so Node.js was created by a wonderful fellow named Ryan Dahl. Amazing guy. I highly encourage you watch some of his talks on YouTube, different conferences. In fact, he did one on Deno and some of the things he wished he had fixed or regrets that he had with Node and why he created Deno in the first place. So I highly encourage you watch that if you're interested. But really, it's basically Node.js just kind of evolved with some of the downsides hopefully removed and some upsides ready to kind of push it into the future. Node.js is getting pretty old now. I think it's more than a decade old. So there are some nice things that have evolved in JavaScript since it's come about in the language that make it a bit kind of time to kind of put in these new concepts from scratch, which is the idea of Deno. So the nice thing about Deno is that it has lots of built-in features that we would in Node.js need libraries to import from either third-party source or even from the internals of Node itself. Node was really started with the premise that kind of it's not batteries included, in the sense that a lot of features that you might need you'd have to import, and npm package repository became a big thing. Which is great, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. But there were some basic things that were kind of missing. They're starting to add them over time. Things like bundling and watch mode and linting and all the kind of stuff that pretty much everyone needs anyways when they're building a project. So a lot of that stuff is built into Deno from the start, so you don't have to import anything. as well as a lot of the HTTP stuff that we're going to be using, but we're going to have the liberty of actually using it in TypeScript, so we can actually inspect the different types, and I can walk through a little bit more detail and some nice error handling as we're actually building out our APIs as well. So that said, that's this part right here. Deno is really built from the ground up to support ES modules, which is the newer syntax that's supported in the browser for actually importing and exporting things. You've probably used this if you use front-end tools to build front-end applications in JavaScript. Whenever you use import or export, that's using ES modules. It has TypeScript, which is quite nice. We're not going to be going too full ham on TypeScript, but it is nice to have in there because the typing information is really going to help us kind of see our own errors, but also some of the internals of how some of these things work. For example, different types of objects like the request and the response, and even our own types that we're going to end up creating together. Also, JSX is kind of built in, so if we do eventually want to transition to not only like a JSON REST API, but also sending back like React and things like that, or JSX style of syntax to build out components, we can do that pretty easily in Node or sorry, in Deno as well, without too much configuration or imports. Deno is built to be security conscious from the start, so I'll show you some examples of that as we start going through the course. We have to tell it that we want to use networking or the file system, for example, before we have access to that. And more recently, it is compatible with most of Node.js. A lot of the NPM modules that you might want to use, you can kind of out of the box use in Deno anyways. There are some exceptions to this. We're not going to be using libraries in this course for the most part, I think, fingers crossed. So it's not really going to matter anyways. But if you do want to use something like Express, for example, you can definitely do that, although Deno has its own versions of that are a bit easier to use anyways. So I encourage you to try this bit of code here, and if you can do this in your head without actually putting this in an interpreter, that'd be great. I'd love to know what you get from running this JavaScript sentence or JavaScript syntax, or this evaluating this JavaScript code. It might give you some insight as to where the name Deno came from. All right, so I just want to go a bit more into why I chose Deno specifically, so that hopefully if you're mad at me for choosing this and not choosing, insert language of your choice, you can forgive me a little bit, at least, for this choice. Now, I care deeply about transferability of skills for these courses and really learning the fundamentals so that you're not always kind of relearning things or only learning the surface of something that's not transferable to another skill. So this is why computer science is definitely quite helpful. A lot of the theory and the fundamentals you learn when you're studying things in computer science field are transferable in just computing in general and technology as well. So Deno kind of abides by this philosophy. One of the challenges with Node and kind of teaching especially and learning how to build APIs in Node is that you immediately start feeling the need to reach out for third-party libraries, which is, in my opinion, not good. Like that's not something that is good, like pedagogically to learn something, and nor is it transferable because that library is not going to be in every other language. So Deno really focuses on abiding to the web standard APIs. So things like the fetch API, the request, the response object, streams, all these different things that are very, very useful that we'll be using even on the front end, like storage APIs and whatnot, events, they're all available in Deno out of the box by default. And they abide to the same exact API that you would find on something like MDN. Okay, I can't emphasize enough how much I love this and how important this is. This is also why I love frameworks that allow us to learn transferable things, web APIs, as you're learning the framework. There are other frameworks that are alternatives to things like React, for example, Remix. There's things like Svelte and a couple others that try to pick and choose from this as well. And I really am happy to see that move forward. And I think that when you're learning these concepts, what we're actually doing is that we're not really learning Deno. We're learning the web APIs, which means that we're actually learning how to build for the web in general. And that's transferable because those are standards and those are not going to change because that's what a standard is. It's meant to be standardized so that we can rely on that not changing, so we can build tools on top of it, no matter what language and what framework we end up using. So hopefully you can appreciate that, and I'm sure that as we start building this and you start seeing the different tools that we end up using, for example, the crypto API, once we actually start doing things like authentication, it's going to be the same one that you actually see in the browser anyways. Now, The other thing that allows us to do is going to ease us into typing on the back end. A lot of you might be coming into this from the front end world, and if you're coming to this from the back end world, you might have already have experience with typing, and that's totally fine. But if you are coming to this from the front end world and you're used to just using JavaScript, where there's it's a dynamic language, there's no static typing, it's going to ease us into that world a little bit and show us why it's necessary for large backend systems. In the front-end world, it's less important or necessary, at least for smaller and medium-sized applications. But in the backend, it becomes more and more complicated to ignore if you are trying to build something in pure JavaScript with no typing information. So we'll see some of those pros and cons as we build this course out together. As I mentioned before, ESM, so ES modules, TypeScript, JSX are all included. It's security first, which is really important, so we don't run arbitrary code in our systems, which is actually kind of terrifying thing that Node actually does, which we don't actually appreciate enough. It's quick enough to get running. There's no extras. It's all kind of batteries included, and it's relying on a modern architecture. Backend, it's actually built on like a Rust core. That are a bunch of bindings to the C++ V8 engine behind the scenes. And if all of that sounds like mumbo jumbo to you, it doesn't really matter. We're not going to go into that. It's just if you have used those tools before, it's kind of neat to know how it's built. So that is the philosophy I'm using for this course. And I put a star on this one because this is really the most important thing. Like if every other reason does not matter to you, I really hope this reason is enough. It seems small, but it really is not. I promise you that it is something that's going to be transferable and will work across different languages in the front end and the back end. And it's super important to know those web standard APIs. Okay, so I'd like to go through each of these tools just so that we have a quick rundown of this, and we can kind of get a hello world running as well, so we're nice and set up when we do actually start building out our first APIs together. So let's start with Deno. To get Deno, just go to Google and type in Deno, and you'll probably see Deno.com. You can go over there. You'll see a nice, cute web page that looks like this, and you can just go to the Install Now button. You can click on that, and you can see a bunch of different instructions on how to get that. You can install it from the command line. There's all these different options. I'm not going to go through how to install that because for each system it's totally different, and this has enough of a walkthrough that you should be able to get that working. If you have installed programs before, that shouldn't be too bad. If you do have issues installing this, for example on Windows, if you're unsure how to use PowerShell or the winget or anything like that, post it in the comments, and I'll try to help you out as much as possible, but hopefully you can get that installed without too much issue. The version as of this video is this version right here, 1.36.4. As long as you're that version or newer, it shouldn't matter. If you do have an older version, I would encourage you to at least upgrade to this version, since that's going to be the version I'm going to be using for this course. But again, the newer versions, at least if it's a minor version bump, like for example, everything after the 1, shouldn't really matter. If you're watching this far in the future where they're at version 2 or 3, I'm not really sure. I can't guarantee that things are going to work and not break, but most of the fundamentals hopefully are still there, since I believe that they want those to be core APIs anyways. So there's some Mac, Windows installations here. Give that a shot and you should be able to get it installed. Once you do have it installed, what you can do is you can pop over to your terminal. So I'm going to actually pull up my VS Code terminal, and I'm gonna show you right here. It's right here on my right side over here. So if you haven't used VS Code, or you're not sure how to set it up with the terminal, again, I have some videos on the channel on both the VS Code and the terminal setup and the basics to how to get it looking like mine if you like. But what you can do is you can type in Deno, D-E-N-O, in the command line, whether it's in VS Code or a regular command line, doesn't matter. And that should drop you in to the actual Deno interpreter. And you can see that I'm on Deno 1.36.4, and I can do things like 1 + 1, and I will get 2. And that is actually working for me, and that's how I know that Deno is installed on my system. So if you do that, and you can press Control D or Command D, or I actually don't know. Yeah, there it is. Control D, Control C, or yeah, you can type close to close it. It's very helpful to get out of that editor or REPL mode. So yeah, I think that that's kind of the core of getting Deno up and running. If you do type that and it's not working, try to reload VS Code or something, or your terminal, and try one more time. If it's still not working, then again, post in the comments, and I'll try my best to help out where possible. Okay, so that's it. That's Deno. It's very similar to installing Node, and we don't need to worry about package managers or anything like that. It's just standalone, and I'll mention why in a second, but it's pretty much mainly to do with ES modules. Okay, so that's Deno. That's what's going to run our JavaScript and TypeScript code, and it has an engine built to do all that, as well as some of its own APIs. VS Code. So if you don't have VS Code, I encourage you to go and download it. I have a video on how to do that, Visual Studio Code. You can go to Google and you can go to their website and you can download that. Again, there's a video on the channel on exactly how to do that and set everything up. So if you need help with that, definitely check that out. But I'm going to assume you have at least an editor installed. It doesn't have to be VS Code. You can use your own if you like. But I'm going to be using this for this course. So you can keep up with me if you are using that. Chrome, you're kind of seeing me use already. That's one of the browser that I'm using. You can download that. It doesn't really have to be Chrome if you're using Safari or Firefox or Brave or something like that. It doesn't really matter. Just the button placement might be different and what they call things might be different. So again, if you want to follow along perfectly, I'm going to be using Chrome, and I'll try to call out where that might be different. Although we're not really going to be using it too much. We're mainly going to be using Insomnia, which is what I'm going to show you next. So Insomnia. Insomnia you can get by going to Google and just typing in Insomnia client, I guess. And REST client right here, so insomnia.rest. Hopefully this URL doesn't change, but if you go to Google, you should be able to find it. Once you actually go there, you should arrive at a site that looks like this. So this is kind of the tool and what it's going to look like. And you should be able to get started. Where is it? Get started for free. Where's your download? So I'll click on get started for free. And oh, there's a download. So they hit it behind this. Now, if you're kind of cautious about the pricing and stuff, fair enough. I try to use tools that are totally free and open source. So you can see that the code for this is up on GitHub. You can click that link to get to it. You can just download this free version right here and install it on your system and use that. That's what I have, which I'll show you in a second. These are mainly for teams or some more advanced features that we're not going to be using, nor would you really need to use anytime soon. So you can pretty much get away for a very, very, very long time or almost indefinitely with just the free version, which is really nice. An alternative that you might have seen, I'll just call this out really quick, is Postman. This is Postman right here, postman.com. So if you prefer to use this or you have this installed, it kind of looks like this. There's a lot more going on with Postman. And some of the features are, I believe, locked behind like having to sign up for accounts and things like that, which is kind of annoying. So I'm just going to click or stick with Insomnia for this course. So once you have that installed, it's going to look something like this. All right. I'm going to just do a quick demo of this just so that we're all on the same page, because there are some small kind of gotchas that are similar across Postman and a lot of these clients. We need to create what's called a collection to work on. And then in that collection, we can create like individual requests. So what I mean is, for example, when you're on this main page, you should be able to see if it's blank, a new collection button in the middle, or in the very, very top right, you should see a plus button and you can make a new request collection. So I can call this, for example, REST API in depth. So the name of this course, and I click create. So once I do that, I am now in this REST API in-depth collection. And if I go back to click on Insomnia, you can see that this is one of my collections and I can make some more over here if I need, or I can just go back into this one. Now, what I can do is I can make a new request in here. So I can click this button right here or click this one right here, and I can make an HTTP request. We're not going to be using these other types of requests in this series, but we'll mention some of them and the different protocols and formats, just so you have an idea that there are other types of requests out there. I'll click new HTTP request. You can click on this button right here and rename it, for example, and I can maybe call this test request. And you can rename it and duplicate it and all that kind of stuff, which is quite nice. I'm going to show you how this works just at a very high level. If I go back to Chrome, I'm going to go to Google and I'm going to search for Pokemon API, one of my favorite APIs. We're going to be building our own API. In fact, you could rebuild something like this from scratch if you like, once you're done with this course. If you scroll down here, you should be able to see a link to Ditto in this case right here. So I'm just going to right click and I'm going to copy that link. Make sure to get the full one right here as opposed to one of these. And if I go back to Insomnia and I paste it up here, that's going to be the link. And if I click on send, what you'll see is we will get back a the JSON for Ditto in this case, which is pretty cool. So this is all the information for Ditto. You can see it's quite long, very, very, very long. There's some pretty cool stuff in there. There's some headers, there's cookies, there's a timeline, which we'll go through all that. And you can change the name, for example, to any Pokemon if you know Pokemon, and you can change that and click send, and you should be able to get information for any Pokemon from this API. So we're going to be building this type of API. So this whole thing right here, we're going to be building from scratch, not for Pokemon, but for other things. Just so that you know how something like this would work behind the scenes. And we're even going to add things like authentication, so you'll have to log in to access certain routes. Okay, so whew, that was a lot. And you can create more requests and save requests and all that kind of stuff just from that menu. So that's really nice. We'll go through a bit more detail as to how to really, really use this as we go through the course and unlock some of the features that we're going to need. But at its core, it really just allows us to interface and communicate with our API, which is quite nice. Okay, so that is Insomnia. So if I come back to our setup here, we're almost done. So that's all of these tools right here. And then we just need to install the extension for VS Code, which is the last thing we need to do. So if I go back to VS Code, I have a folder open already. So I encourage you to open this folder. You can do like file and you can do open folder to open a folder, or you can just drag and drop a folder into VS Code. Again, that's in the VS Code setup video. If you're not sure how to do that, you can check that out. But this is the directory I'm in right here. And I have ability to write code in here. Now, what we're going to want to do is go to extensions, which is this menu here in VS Code on the left-hand side. And you're going to want to search for the Deno extension, D-E-N-O. And it should be the first one by Deno Land that looks like this. I have it installed already, so it's saying disable, but you should see an install button show up, and it should allow you to install it. You can read through kind of all the things that it includes. The version shouldn't really matter too much as long as it's the most modern version installed. You can see that this is the series of steps on how to actually use this extension, which I'll mention in a second. We're mainly going to be using this last step right here, but it unlocks quite a lot of nice features so that we can easily use Deno inside of VS Code without having to get too much set up. So one of those features that it unlocks once you install this, and by the way, if you install this and this is not working, you can always totally quit VS Code. So you can like right click this and quit and restart it, or you can Control Shift P and reload window, and that should work. But what we can do here is once you have it installed, you can do Control Shift P or Command Shift P, and we can type Deno in here. And we're going to see hopefully this show up, which is coming from the extension, which is Deno Initialize Workspace Configuration. This is just going to create a nice workspace directory for VS Code that uses some defaults, and I'll show you what the file does in a second. But if you click on that or press enter, it's going to ask you, do you want linting, which is the thing that tells us and makes squigglies to tell us that we're doing something wrong or right, or if we should watch out for things. Generally pretty helpful. It can be a bit annoying, so I'll just click yes for now. Enable Deno Unstable APIs. I'm going to press no for that, and I'll mention what those are as we start working more and more with Deno. I'm going to just press yes and then no. So that's going to create this file right here in the .vscode folder called settings.json. If I open it, you'll see that I have Deno.enable true, Deno.lint is true, and Deno.unstable is false. And this is JSON setting file, just so VS Code knows how we want our code to work. So that's pretty nice. So I'll close that, and I'll close that folder. And I'm going to simply make a new file here, and I'm going to call it intro.ts for TypeScript. Okay. And again, if you're thinking that TypeScript is terrifying or you're not interested in TypeScript, that's totally fine. We're not really going to be going too far into TypeScript. In fact, we're mainly going to be writing JavaScript with a little bit of TypeScript involved where it's necessary. And I'll start to show where it's more and more necessary, but it should be very similar to most other type languages for the most part anyways. So hopefully you don't get too hung up on the fact that we are using TypeScript, but we're going to try to use it and incrementally adopt it throughout this course. So I want to try something in here. I'm going to say console.log, and I'm going to say hello from Deno. All right. And once I do that, I'm going to save the file. So I'll Command S. I'm going to switch over to my terminal again, make sure I'm in the same folder. So if I do an ls, I should see my intro.ts file. And I'm going to run Deno, and then I'm going to run intro.ts. Oops, not intro, Deno run intro.ts. And we should see hello from Deno. And that means that Deno is installed, it's running in VS Code correctly, and our terminal is able to actually run that file and we have no errors. If you do see errors after running Deno run and then the name of your file, try to see if the errors are helpful. Most of the time, they're pretty helpful to get things running. You can try to restart VS Code. Maybe it might be that the environment just needs to be refreshed. Make sure you have the setup going that I just mentioned for this. So if you Deno initialize workspace, make sure all that is set up correctly and you should be good. One more thing in here is I'm going to just do Deno dot console log Deno dot, and then I'll do version just to really show that we are, and I'll save that and I'll rerun it just to really show that we are grabbing things from Deno. And this is going to show all the information for the current Deno version that I'm running, the V8 engine behind the scenes, and the TypeScript version as well. And again, if your version doesn't match, as long as it's this one or newer, it should be fine. We're going to go deeper into this later, but you can see Deno is the global namespace where Deno-specific non-standard APIs are located. So we'll see where this is different from the web standard APIs, and how some of the things that we are going to be using are coming from the Deno APIs directly, like starting the web server. But there are a lot of APIs. For example, the response object is here, and you can see that that's over there. We have the crypto API, the subtle API, for example, and there's a whole bunch of really nice stuff in there that we'll use for authentication. And Deno is going to have a serve API that we're going to start using later on, that we can actually start a web server on pretty quickly in just a couple lines of code to actually get our first REST API up and running. But before then, we're going to go through a little bit of theory. So that was a lot of setup, but hopefully I kind of brisked through it, but hopefully you got everything working and you can play around in here and write some different logs and check out what's in the Deno global object and some of the web APIs and see how they work. By the way, if you're interested, I would highly encourage you to go to Google and go to Deno's website. And once you have that, you can go to their documentation. And I think they have it under the runtime API or manual. Manual, that's the one right here. They might reorganize this at some point. There's a whole bunch of really cool stuff over here that you can learn. For example, the runtime API, you can see that there's a bunch of stuff in here to give you some idea of where we'll be going. For example, with creating a web server, but also some other things in there. They have some great examples on how to do some pretty cool stuff with Deno pretty quickly, including a hello world and a getting started page and the basics and all that kind of fun stuff. But we're going to be going through this in the series together. This is just an extra resource for you to look at, as well as where you can find out, how I would look up this stuff if I wanted to know how some of these APIs worked behind the scenes. So there you have it. That is the setup. So we have all of these tools set up. We got Deno going, we got VS Code going, we have Insomnia to actually interface with the APIs, which we're going to be building ourselves. We looked at Chrome a little bit, and then we have the extension, and we tested it out in VS Code to make sure it actually works. So what we're going to be doing in the next video together is finally starting to get into some theory. So we need to learn things like some of the protocols, a bit of how things like DNS and all that kind of stuff works, before we can really have an understanding of how a REST API works, because we're going to be using things like ports and IP addresses and domains. So before we really dive in and just start hammering away at that stuff, it's very useful to actually know what those are in the first place. So that's going to be the topic of the next video. I can't wait to get to that one. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.